The next time you pull into a gas station and wince at the number on the pump, consider this. You may not be paying what the market actually demands. You may be paying what someone decided you would pay. And until recently, almost no one with legal authority was watching closely enough to know the difference. Across the United States, the price of a gallon of gasoline has become one of the most consequential numbers in a household budget. It shapes how far people commute, whether a small business can afford its delivery fleet, and how much is left at the end of the month after the tank is full. For middle-class families, fuel is not an abstract cost. It is a fixed, unavoidable expense that arrives every few days with no negotiation and no alternative. For most of the history of retail gasoline in this country, pricing at the station level operated almost entirely without dedicated oversight. That is beginning to change. State watchdogs are now investigating whether the prices consumers pay reflect genuine market forces, or something else. To understand why these investigations matter, it helps to understand the basic structure of what happens between a barrel of crude oil and the gallon of gas you pump into your car. The price at the pump is not set by the station owner alone. It is shaped by the global price of crude oil, the cost of refining that crude into usable fuel, the wholesale price paid by distributors, state and federal taxes, and finally the retail markup applied at the station. Each layer adds cost. Each layer can also become a place where prices move faster in one direction than the evidence supports. At the retail level, the data is notable. According to industry figures from NACS, the National Association of Convenience Stores, gas stations typically earn between 1 and 3 cents per gallon on fuel. The overwhelming majority of what consumers pay passes through the station and up the chain to wholesalers, refiners, and crude producers. In most cases, the station itself is not where excessive profit is captured. That does not make price gouging at the retail level impossible. And it does not mean that every price spike is fully explained by what is happening upstream. The gap between what costs justify and what consumers are charged is what investigators are now working to measure. The legal definition of price gouging is more specific than everyday use of the term suggests, and that specificity has direct consequences for what watchdogs can and cannot do. In most states, price gouging laws do not apply continuously. They are triggered by a specific legal event, a declared state of emergency. Once a governor, or relevant authority, issues that declaration in response to a hurricane, a pandemic, or a major supply disruption, the price gouging statute activates. Before that declaration, prices can rise substantially. And in most states, that rise is entirely legal, regardless of the impact on consumers. Approximately 34 to 37 states have price gouging laws on the books, according to the National Conference of State Legislatures. The thresholds vary considerably. Some states define price gouging as any increase above 10% of the pre-emergency price. Others set the threshold at 25%. Some give regulators broad discretion. The result is a patchwork of protections that differs significantly depending on where a consumer lives and what kind of emergency has been declared. That structure means millions of Americans have experienced price spikes that felt disconnected from any reasonable justification, without any legal mechanism to address them, either because the right declaration was never made or because their state's law did not apply to their circumstances. Follows a consistent pattern. A crisis occurs, prices spike, consumers complain, investigations begin, some fines are issued. The cycle resets after Hurricane Katrina made landfall in August 2005 and devastated the Gulf Coast. Gasoline prices surged across multiple states. Louisiana, Mississippi, and neighboring states all saw rapid increases at the pump. State attorneys general launched investigations. Numerous gas station owners were fined and prosecuted. Under state statutes, the scale of those prosecutions led several states to return to their price gouging laws and strengthen them. The same pattern repeated. When the COVID-19 pandemic began in March 2002 and governors across the country issued emergency declarations, the Federal Trade Commission received thousands of price gouging complaints. Multiple state attorneys general opened investigations, and other retailers. In Florida, New York, Texas, and elsewhere, individual station owners received fines and cease and desist orders. The National Association of Attorneys General coordinated multi-state efforts to share information and align enforcement strategies. The response was broader than anything that had come before. The fundamental dynamic, however, remained unchanged. Consumers were harmed first. Investigations followed. Accountability, when it came, arrived well after the damage was done. On June 14, 2022, the national average price for a gallon of gasoline reached $5.16, according to AAA. It was a record, and it was felt immediately by every household that owned a vehicle. The causes were documented. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 had sent global oil markets into turmoil. Supply chains, already strained by the pandemic, were disrupted further. Crude oil prices rose sharply. Refining capacity was constrained. These were genuine upstream pressures. The question investigators and economists began asking was not whether prices should rise, The question was whether prices rose beyond what the underlying costs justified, and whether they declined as quickly as they should have when those costs began to ease. This is where a documented economic pattern becomes directly relevant to household budgets. Researchers, including economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, have studied what is known as the rockets and feathers effect. Gas prices tend to rise quickly when crude oil prices go up, but fall considerably more slowly when crude oil prices come back down. The consumer pays the difference during that gap, sometimes for weeks or months, in the form of prices that remain elevated after the conditions driving them have already improved. This is a documented pattern, studied academically, and it is one of the central dynamics that state watchdog investigations are designed to detect. At the federal level, the Federal Trade Commission has authority to investigate unfair or deceptive practices. Under Section 5 of the FTC Act, in November 2021, the FTC sent letters to large oil and gas companies requesting pricing information amid rising fuel costs. In 2022, the agency released a report examining whether oil companies had engaged in price gouging, a report that documented record profits at major oil companies during the 2021 and 22 price surges. The FTC, however, does not set gas prices. Its authority over individual retail stations is limited. Federal oversight, as currently structured, is better positioned to examine the behavior of large corporations than to address what happens at a neighborhood gas station. The power to protect consumers at the retail level sits primarily with the states. For most of American history, that state-level power has been exercised reactively, activated by emergencies, driven by consumer complaints, and wound down once the immediate crisis passed. There was no permanent, dedicated mechanism for continuous monitoring of whether fuel prices were tracking what cost actually justified. California's response to this gap is the most structurally significant development in fuel price oversight anywhere in the United States within the period covered by available research. California's gas pricing situation is distinctive by several measures. The state requires a unique fuel blend that meets California Air Resources Board standards, produced by a limited number of refineries. The state carries high fuel taxes, and for years, analysts observed that California gas prices included a premium that taxes, crude costs, and refining expenses could not fully account for. Studies conducted by California in 2022 and 2023 documented this unexplained premium. The gap was measurable, and it represented real money leaving California households every time residents filled their tanks. The legislative response was Assembly Bill 1322, which created the Division of Petroleum Market Oversight, the DPMO, housed within the California Energy Commission. It was a permanent institutional watchdog with ongoing authority to monitor fuel pricing, examine unusual price spikes, and refer findings to the state attorney general for enforcement action. The DPMO's significance lies in the model it represents. Rather than waiting for a crisis or relying on consumer complaints, California created an agency whose specific purpose is to monitor the fuel market on a continuous basis, to assess, regularly, whether the price consumers pay at the pump is connected to what it actually costs to produce and deliver that fuel. Whether its enforcement actions produce measurable relief for household budgets is something the ongoing record will have to establish. Any complete account of this issue includes the perspective of those subject to investigation, because that perspective rests on a substantive argument. NACS has consistently maintained that retail gas stations are price takers, not price setters. They do not determine the wholesale cost of the fuel they sell. When crude oil prices rise, when refinery output falls, when distribution costs increase, those costs arrive at the station and are passed to the consumer. Station owners operating on margins of 1 to 3 cents per gallon have limited capacity to absorb those costs and limited influence over what drives them. The argument points to a real structural question. Investigations focused on retail stations may address the most visible segment of the price chain without examining where the largest margins are actually captured. If pricing power resides primarily with refiners or wholesalers, then scrutinizing individual station owners may produce accountability in the wrong place. The response from consumer advocates and regulators is that both can be true at the same time. Retail price gouging during declared emergencies is documented. The structural factors that drive prices higher throughout the supply chain are also documented. The FTC's 2022 report, which recorded exceptional profits at major oil companies during the price surge, supports the position that the supply chain above the retail level warrants at least as much scrutiny as the stations consumers interact with directly. When a state attorney general launches a price gouging investigation, the most immediate effect is often deterrent. The announcement signals to station owners that prices are being monitored, complaints are being reviewed, and accountability is possible. In the middle of a crisis, that signal can carry practical weight. The documented outcomes of investigations include fines, consent decrees, and in serious cases, referrals for criminal prosecution. Across cases from Hurricane Katrina to the COVID-19 pandemic, numerous station owners faced financial penalties. For price gouging violations, investigations do not, however, bring prices down in real time. They do not restore supply. They do not address the upstream factors that drive wholesale fuel costs. A consumer paying an inflated price during an active investigation will not see relief while that investigation is ongoing. Accountability, when it arrives, is retrospective. This is the central tension. In price gouging enforcement, the harm to consumers is immediate. The response is not in the window. Between the price spike and any enforcement action, households absorb costs that will not be recovered. The DPMO model in California is designed in part to address this tension, moving from reactive enforcement to continuous monitoring, so that unusual pricing can be identified and examined more quickly than the traditional complaint-driven process allows. Price tracking platforms like GasBuddy have increased transparency in the retail fuel market. When consumers can see in real time what every nearby station is charging, the ability of any single station to sustain an unjustified premium is reduced. Visible competition functions as its own form of constraint. The limits of that transparency become apparent during declared emergencies, when roads are closed, when fuel supply is restricted, and when consumers cannot travel to find a cheaper alternative. The normal competitive dynamic breaks down. A consumer evacuating ahead of a hurricane does not have the means to comparison shop. A family dependent on a single nearby station because they cannot afford the time or fuel to seek alternatives is, in practical terms, a captive customer, and captive customers are precisely whom price gouging statutes were written to protect. This is why the complaint-driven model of investigation has always been imperfect. The consumers most harmed during emergencies are often the least positioned to file detailed complaints, navigate regulatory processes, or wait for institutional remedies. The gap between those who need protection most and those the system most readily serves has persisted across every major price gouging episode in the documented record. The verified record on this subject shows the following. Gas prices in the United States are shaped by forces at multiple levels of a supply chain, only the last of which, the retail station, is directly visible. To the consumer, the laws designed to protect consumers from price gouging vary by state, activate inconsistently, and in most cases apply only after emergency declarations that may or may not coincide with the conditions, causing prices to rise. Investigations by state attorneys general and federal agencies have produced documented accountability. In specific cases, fines have been issued, consent decrees have been signed, prosecutions have occurred. The pattern, however, repeats: crisis, price spike, complaints, investigation, retrospective accountability. And then, until the next crisis, limited ongoing oversight. California's creation of the Division of Petroleum Market Oversight is the most structurally significant attempt to break that pattern by making oversight continuous rather than reactive. Whether other states adopt a similar approach, whether the DPMO's monitoring produces faster and more effective consumer protection, and whether retail-level investigations are matched by equivalent scrutiny further up the supply chain are questions. The current period of fuel price oversight has placed directly in front of regulators and legislators. What is not in question is who absorbs the cost when oversight is absent or arrives too late. It is the person at the pump, the commuter calculating whether to fill the tank completely, the small business owner watching fuel costs reduce already thin margins, the household managing a budget in which one unavoidable line item keeps rising without a clear or satisfying explanation. The investigations are underway, the institutional questions are being examined. Whether the answers produce durable change or whether the cycle continues as it has before is something consumers have a direct and material interest in following.